So, hi, Chad. It's a pleasure to see you again. Thanks for taking the time. You and I have had a couple of conversations about some of the challenges faced by ILECs as it pertains to replacing switching equipment, but maintaining compliance with universal service funding. And I thought it'd be a good opportunity to kind of record a session on it and maybe help answer some of the questions some of our ILEC customers have had. For the viewers' benefit, my name is Maximillien. I'm the CEO of TelcoBridges, and I'm joined by Chad Holzer. Chad, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, senior manager, Moss Adams, in our communications and media practice, work with rural ILECs all across the country.
Kicking things off here, there's a lot of terms thrown around when it comes to this topic. And so, what is an eligible telecom carrier and what is an incumbent local exchange carrier?
Yeah, a lot of acronyms in the industry, Max. So ETC status is actually it's going to be designated by the state, and that could be by the state PUC, the state commission, whoever is going to regulate the ILEC or the phone company at the state level. That ETC status is kind of the first step, or very important to then go to step two, which is be eligible for federal universal funding. And in order to receive specifically CAF BLS, Connect America Fund broadband loop support, HCLS, high cost loop support, and then we'll get into later a bunch of the ACAM, the alternative cost allocation models, which are all forms of universal funding specifically meant to go towards an ILEC. And the ILEC, as you have on the screen, is the incumbent local exchange carrier, which means they are the phone company or entity that existed after the AT&T divestiture and are meant to provide phone service to the residents within a deemed service area. So if you were to take a map and draw circles or boundaries around it, any resident or business within that area, the ILEC is, for intensive purposes, required to provide them voice service unless deemed to be just unreasonably too high cost or unable to get services to them.
Why do ILECs care about universal service funding?
On average, it can be anywhere between 75 and 85% of their revenue stream from uh, total operations. And so without it, they would need to, as I went back earlier, they would need to charge consumers anywhere from $250 to $350 a month just for plain old telephone service. And so basically, if they weren't eligible or didn't receive universal service funding, it would be very hard to keep the operations running, especially with increased competition, where a Comcast or another entity would be able to come in and offer a low cost option or a reasonable cost option where they would need to bill you in excess of 250 a month.
Well, it sounds like it's the majority of the revenue for a lot of ILECs.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say pretty confidently it's definitely more than 50% of the revenue at all the ILECs. And so without it, they would be pretty hard stretched to not just even maintain the network, but any future builds of replacing old plant, specifically copper, an old switch. There just wouldn't be an additional cash flow to sustain the operations. And so the universal service funding allows them to not just maintain, but then build out their network to meet the demands of consumers.
ILECs and our ILEC customers have some pretty old equipment still deployed in their network and equipment that comes from, voice 10, 20 years ago. And so I'm curious what you've heard and what you've seen as to why ILECs should or are considering moving away from their legacy switching equipment.
And so you have a couple things. You have the technology changes where it's a lot cheaper to purchase a media gateway or a new switch that is smaller and easier to maintain than the old legacy switches. You also have a workforce issue, a resource surrounding the amount of employees or engineers out there that understand the ins and the outs of a legacy switch and how to maintain them. And so companies are also looking to become more cost effective, become lean. And so those old switches are cumbersome and typically more costly than going to a newer platform that are available out there.
And so, how can ILECs update their equipment while maintaining compliance with FCC regulations so that they can continue to receive universal service funding?
Another question that comes up all the time is companies would like to what the industry would like and what ILECs would like to do is in some cases get out of the switching business. They would like to fully send it off to a third party and allow that to happen. The tariff language that ultimately surrounds the ladder restrictions, the boundaries where traffic needs to originate and terminate, says that the switch needs to exist within the ladder. And so, working through the rules and regulations, partnering with NECA and other industry experts, it's kind of been determined that a class 4 switch needs to exist within the ladder. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a neighboring ILEC or a third party has to have the switch within the company's direct central office. It's just that the switching functionality can happen within the ladder. So we've seen a lot of change occur in the last few years where neighboring ILECs or even competing CLECs are partnering together to consolidate their switching functionality down to one switch. They partner together, which has allowed for cost savings and reducing the workforce.
Awesome. Now, I'd like to move on to kind of the solution to this problem of having legacy, expensive switches, but wanting to maintain universal service funding. And so we've actually deployed our media gateways with a number of ILECs kind of in this exact context. The key being our media gateways perform all of the functions that a typical kind of quote unquote class 4 switch would, and we meet the requirements that you listed earlier. But kind of in your view, is your understanding that the TelcoBridges T Media gateways satisfy this switching in the ladder requirement such that ILECs can continue to receive universal service funding?
Yeah, I mean, obviously every situation can be unique, but if it meets the class 4 switching functionality and is located physically located within the ILEC, what we've been seeing with ILECs is that it's satisfied the regulatory requirements and is in full compliance, and those companies continue to receive universal service funding.
Got it. So you've worked with ILECs that have deployed TelcoBridges T Media gateways in order to meet this requirement, and they so far so good.
Yeah, yep, I have, and they've continued to meet the ETC status and receive support.
In those cases, what was the reason for which they went ahead with purchasing and installing media gateways?
Yeah, so there's a saying from someone I used to work with that ILECs are like snowflakes, not any two are the same. And so companies typically are, especially model-based company, where their support is fixed and frozen. Meaning it doesn't matter what they spend on the network. They're not going to get any additional funding from the Universal Service Fund. And so they start looking at making cost-effective decisions. And so the switch, depending on how costly it was, they're going to look at cost savings. And so upgrading to a media gateway, a class 4 switch, and partnering with a class 5 third party switch provider allowed them to reduce costs by eliminating maintenance costs as well as not having to replace employees and significantly reducing their payroll.
Got it. So there's a total cost of ownership for the switching function there, where there was an old legacy switch that was replaced by class 5 software and a class 4 T media gateway installed, and the gateway being installed in the LATA for ETC designation and universal service funding.
Yes, that's correct. And so it typically comes down to cost, and then it'll come down to the life cycle of where the company's at in their network upgrade and getting kind of caught up with current technology. We can see switches purchased anywhere from 5 years ago to maybe I've seen one as far back as 20 years ago. And so eventually that equipment does become end of life and it is needed to upgrade the network.
What can those cost savings become pretty important?
I would say they become very important. Whether you're model based or not, any support surrounding switching has been frozen and is trending down 5% each year. And so there is a benefit to lock in the amount of support you receive at the higher amount versus a much lower cost incurred.
Got it. That's great. And I think it's worth just spending a little bit of time outlining that the T media gateways, the T media gateway performs the class 4 switch functions, as we talked about, and are compatible with a variety of different kind of class 5 software vendors. So there's a couple of them on the screen here. And to your point, Chad, what we've seen be a popular kind of deployment is there's a class 5 set of features in something like a meta switch or an Alianza or NetSapiens environment. And the T media gateway is used to maintain ETC status and universal service funding, and then is used also as kind of for the TDM interconnection piece. And so is this consistent with kind of what you've seen in deployments as well?
Yeah. There's as you probably have seen, there's all different varieties, but what you've described here is the typical way an ILEC has gone about upgrading their network from a traditional soft switch or legacy switch to a new media gateway class 4 platform and interconnecting with a third party class 5 carrier.
I guess specific questions related to this kind of deployment. Do T media gateways need to be installed according to specific network topology rules within the LATA to ensure compliance with universal service funding?
Yeah. As far as the topology, you know, I can't speak to that from an engineering perspective, but the general answer is no. As long as the media gateway, the class 4 switching functionality is occurring within the LATA, having one or having multiple deployed throughout your ILEC territory for contingency, redundancy purposes, all satisfies the requirements from a tariffing perspective. So no, there's not necessarily a requirement to have more than one, as long as you build the network to have redundancy, to reduce downtime, and to get customers connected or back to service as quickly as possible.
Awesome. Do ILECs have to notify the FCC if they installed T media gateways in their LATAs?
Yeah, so there are rules surrounding notifying the FCC when you are making a technology change within your ILEC for switching functionality. Um, Dependent upon the switch that you are replacing, you very well may need to notify the FCC. Most companies have been having a upgrade, is what I would call it, from a legacy switch to a media gateway that necessarily the technology hasn't changed. It was a soft switch before, and it's a soft switch today going to the new media gateway. So there wasn't a technology change that occurred requiring you to notify the FCC. Now, in very what I would call rare cases, there could be legacy step-by-step switch or something even older that you would need to notify the FCC because that's going to be a technology change.
Understood. Makes sense. Are there considerations other than the physical equipment they purchase? And you alluded to some of them earlier, but I'm curious if you can elaborate on it. You mentioned things like personnel. You mentioned things like how expensive some of the legacy equipment is to maintain. Curious if you can formalize your view around kind of additional considerations.
Yeah. What we usually run through, or usually I talk with companies about, is ultimately what are they looking for, and what is driving the need to retire the old switch. Is it becoming end of life? Is it the maintenance contracts? And so those should be considered when looking for a new piece of equipment. Is the history of the company? What are their customer service features surrounding downtime maintenance when there's trouble issues with the media gateway? Are employees retiring? And if employees are retiring, who's going to be able to troubleshoot any issues that are coming in? You had a slide where you showed the integration of using a third-party classified switch vendor. So numbering resources are a consideration that companies should look into, not just within their ILEC, but you could use the same piece of equipment to provide competitive local exchange or be a CLEC or voice service outside of your ILEC. Do they have numbering resources there? As well as if your internal employee will not be there to maintain it, what type of service level agreement are you going to get there? As well as what I would call, I think you showed billing. Does it have billing interface capabilities? As well as how does the consumer interact? Is there any consumer interface that interacts with a company to modify services or troubleshoot tickets?
Okay, that's great. We've actually come across a lot of the issues you just mentioned, namely around just the needing, support and maintenance and a high kind of service level there, and also the need for personnel and kind of network monitoring and network expertise. And so we actually offer kind of free replacements and a lifetime warranty on our T-Media units. We have world-class support that's accessible 24/7. And we have a monitoring and alert system for folks that want to get notified on how their system is doing, or that want to set specific thresholds on a variety of metrics so that they get notified as opposed to having to manually be watching the system on an ongoing basis. And this is, of course, on top of our no end of life policy. And so we are working with ILECs, have worked with ILECs, and want to continue working with ILECs who are looking to update some of the equipment in their network while maintaining universal service funding.